we're back talking with Susan Medwied about the career of law. And we just got through talking about how Susan decided to get into law. Now we're going to talk about, well, what is this field? What is it all about? And so I want you to think about someone who has no idea what being an attorney is. Can you give us some sense of, what's the work like? What do you do? What's a typical day like? What would a person do? And I know you had said when we were on break that there are many different versions of that. Maybe you can start with kind of the basics that any attorney would do, and then tell us a little bit about the different types of attorneys and how it might be different.
Well, I think you need the core skills.
Mm-hmm.
So the core skills are, although most lawyers are passionate about reading, not all are, but you have to be able to read in depth.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to analyze fact situations.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to write, although obviously some lawyers write better than others.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to verbally communicate, and I
Mm-hmm.
think most important, you have to be able to listen.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in court, for example, you better be listening to that judge or watching that jury so that you know how to craft your argument in a way that's compelling. When you're talking to a client, you have to listen not just to what they say, but what their nonverbal language is so that you can elicit their goals.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes, especially high school kids will say, well, my mom says I should be a lawyer because I argue all the time. And it's not about arguing, it is about advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
It is about understanding your client's goal and taking your position to help them get there. So on a day-to-day basis, there's a lot of time on the computer.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of time writing and responding, these days to emails more than letters.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of listening to people on the phone. We still have phone and in-person conferences. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just emails or texts,
Mm-hmm.
but it's deep conversations. If what you want is a quick answer, law is probably not for you. It's more complex than that.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you can't ever get to an answer, if you just are pondering, perhaps philosophy would be better for you,
Mm-hmm.
because there has to be a concrete aspect to law as well.
Okay, so what kinds of things would you be reading, for example? Would it be contracts or books or laws? Or, what kinds of things would an attorney be spending their time reading and analyzing?
During law school, certainly what we read is case law. And
Okay.
so we read case upon case upon case, which give you fact situations, and here's the law and here's how to apply it.
Okay.
On a practical level, once you're an attorney, you have to determine what's the law, what are the cases interpreting the law, not just the U.S. Supreme Court, but the cases all along, what judge you're going to be in front of,
Mm-hmm.
and who the opposing party is and who their attorney is, in a way to, again, craft your argument in a
Mhm.
compelling way. And more than that, because it's not about just squashing the other side, because there
Mhm.
almost always is another side.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about figuring out what they want and how to get it to them
Mhm.
without compromising your position.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So you were talking about listening and how that's such an important skill, and then there's this balance, there's a spectrum you're talking about. So you can't be one of those people that's just cut to the chase. I just want, 3 bullets and then I'm off. So you have to be able to listen and really try to figure out what the client wants. But at the same time, if you're going to listen and kind of get carried away on different tangents, then you're going to be over here and you're just going to get lost in the woods with your client. So there's a way of listening for specific things to get to a specific piece of information.
Yes, but there's also 2 aspects of it.
Mm-hmm.
The law is not just a piece of paper and rules.
Mhm.
The law impacts people's lives,
Mhm.
whether it's their freedom in criminal law, their very personal aspect in a personal injury or family law case,
Mhm.
their business in a contract or a patent case. And so on the one hand, you have to listen to the client because they have to be able to vent.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, after you allow them and they have to feel heard.
Mhm.
After they feel heard, then you have to kind of take them down the path as to what facts are relevant and which are not.
Ah, okay.
So you have to understand, here's the law, here's the argument we need to make, and this is where you have to fit in or you don't fit in, and I get to give you bad news.
Mm-hmm. Now that must not be fun. So you also probably have to be good at giving people bad news. How often do you have to do that?
A fair amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
A fair amount of time.
And how do you handle that?
I think it's more that you have to be compassionate towards people. But you also have to tell them that the law is no better than real life, and so it reflects real life. Whether it's this contract that you wrote, and even though you felt pushed to sign it, there was no gun at your head, and so you signed it, you were stuck with it. So you have to explain to people that there's some things you can't get them out of. Some things that they've done that they're stuck with without them feeling stupid or without them losing hope.
Oh gosh, so yeah, verbal skills.
And you have to be comfortable with conflict. Because you're going to have conflict sometimes with your clients, but more typically with the opposing party or opposing counsel.
So can you give me an example of that off the top of your head, or?
There are times that it gets so bad that opposing counsel will call and scream at you, sometimes for lengthy periods of time. And you have to sometimes say, as I have once, you know, let me guess that your client is in the room with you, so I'm going to hang up, you can keep talking, and when your client is gone and we can have a reasonable discussion, you can call me back.
Oh my goodness.
Occasionally, clients are in a high-stress situation, and so the way I describe it to my staff is, I can tolerate it if a client is unhappy or frustrated and wants to call and scream at me. But if you scream at my staff, you're history, because they don't have to tolerate that. But I do, and you become a little tougher about it.
And is there a process that you went through to sort of toughen up?
I think I've always been somewhat emotional, but that's also been balanced by having firm boundaries. And I think, like in every career, you have to have firm boundaries, because at least half the time, sometimes closer to 75%, when someone is screaming at you or very unhappy with a situation, it has absolutely nothing to do with you and everything to do with them or their situation or something they have to tell their business partner or their spouse. And so you can't take it personally.
Yep, really wise advice. So let's talk back on your journey, because you talked a little bit about how there's so many different types of law. Can you maybe help us differentiate? I mean, I would imagine that someone wouldn't have to make a decision about what type of law to go into right away. They would just maybe go into law school, but then when would they have to start distinguishing between the different types, and how would they know maybe what might be more suited to them?
I think, like much of life, what's really important is figuring out who you are, what your strengths are, what your comfort level is. So when I described before, there are certainly people who really love trial work, and that's a different type of skill than people who really love transactional work, which is people who never go to trial, but they delve deeply into documents before or afterwards. And there are people who just don't like other people, but they really love intellectual arguments, and they tend to go into appellate work, where they don't have to interact with clients much at all.
That's interesting. I think our traditional view of a lawyer is that they would have to go to trial, but now you're saying that there are these other two options. One is transactional work. Can you tell me what transactional work is a little more specifically?
Typically things like contracts, agreements, licensing. Remember, I'm a business lawyer, so I focus on that. But there's transactional aspects in everything that we do. In an insurance policy that's going to guide whether or not you get a defense on this case. In the settlement agreement that's going to be crafted at the end of your divorce or your personal injury claim. In how you submit your patent application. So the other aspect of it is, what's your background? It's rare for someone in human services or with a philosophy or art degree to go into patent law. Most people in patent law have a biotech or a chemistry or an engineering background.
Okay.
But as to everything else, unlike medical school where you need biology and PChem and all that kind of stuff, for law school you could really be any major. There tend to be some themes, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right, okay, so if you had your undergrad in chemistry or biology, then you might kind of naturally lean towards, as you said, patent work.
Or not, or you might be interested in transactional or litigation work that involved things like large biotech firms or hospitals, because those are not only the skill set that you have, or perhaps a language that you're familiar with, it's something that you have a passion for.
That's so interesting, because now I'm starting to think of other attorneys I know, and how I have one that just sort of lit up at the idea of advocating for women in companies, and she's in employment law. And then I have another one that I know, the one that was on our success team, and how she wanted to she was doing what, adoption,
Right.
right? So an adoption attorney. So now I'm beginning to realize, oh my goodness, so you could be an attorney, but yet you could apply it in so many different places.
Well, there was something else that you brought up that triggered a thought in me, which is it's also important to know through law school and through your early career what you really don't like. Like much of life, it's easier for most people to figure out what they don't like than what they do like.
Right, and so again, those slammed doors kind of guide you, and you're like, ugh, I don't like doing this.
Right.
But it sounds like there's so many different options in law that even if there's a whole bunch of things you don't like about it, you usually can find something that you like, plenty that you like. Okay, maybe one more question about your journey. You said that you had an interesting story about how you thought you really liked criminal law, I think.
Right.
Can you tell us that?
Sure. Again, when I started law school, I had no idea what type of lawyer I wanted to be, but I loved the thought of doing criminal work. And so I took every criminal law class, every criminal evidence class, every criminal advocacy class, and I just really enjoyed them until the summer between second and third year of law school. I clerked at the Federal Public Defender's Office, and I realized I don't like this at all. I just don't find it intellectually challenging at all. I find much of the trial work in criminal law is kind of shooting from the hip. This is just not who I am. So again, it's that gasp of, now what? And so I had to sit down and think, well, what are the classes that I excelled at? And I was horrified to see what they were, because I had no background in it and no thought of going into them. But they tended to be the business and the commercial code and wills and estates. And I thought, are you kidding me? So you have to reassess, well, wait a minute, what did I like about them? What was I good at? And try that path. Now, if you are blessed with an opportunity, for example, out of law school and being in a very large firm, the better firms will allow you to rotate between a variety of areas so that you can figure that out.
That's great. Okay, so my goodness, a whole career. What are some surprises? What are some, so, you went into it, we talked about the strengths. Anything that someone might typically assume, other than what we've already talked about, that might surprise them?
I think a lot of people are intellectually engaged in law, but have no experience working with people. So, for example, as I mentioned, as someone who grew up working class, I've worked my entire life. But for people who haven't, you get out of law school at 25, 26 years old, and this is your first job. You have no idea how to interact with clients, but more importantly, you have no idea how to interact with staff, with coworkers, with bosses. So any job that you have, it doesn't have to be in any particular field, will help you in navigating your first job and jobs, because there'll be more than one.
Right, so I guess one thing that we can say is that you should have a part-time job and just get regular job experience to pave the way.
Absolutely.
So you're not coming out of graduate school completely cold,
Right.
and not knowing the basic skills of how to work in an office. Okay, we'll take another quick break now, and I really appreciate what we've talked about so far.